It won't be too long before you're not able to see something like this Echo trimmer at the big box stores, so in my mind, I'm going to try and save as many as I can. However, just because you can do something doesn't mean you'll be able to, and this one doesn't go as smoothly as I was hoping for. At least I'll be able to share what happened with this one, that way hopefully what happened to me doesn't happen to you. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Echo string trimmer, and the problem is that after years in storage, it won't start and run, and now the entire fuel system needs to be serviced. And when I say it needs servicing, I'm talking about everything. You're also going to see what happens when you use ethanol fuel in these small engines, and it's not pretty. Now, I'm going to try and repair this trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in this video, please ask about it. I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, with everything that's gasoline being phased out and in its place is something, well, I'll phrase it as the next step in technology, I'm going to have to admit that I'm not ready to make that switch just yet. So when I had a coworker reach out to me and ask me to fix this beautiful Echo trimmer, I jumped at the opportunity. However, it does bring up a few interesting points about aftermarket parts and their existence and what's going to happen when they're no longer around. I'll get back to that topic here in a bit, but before we continue, I do want to look over this machine just to get an idea of what I'm working with. Of course, this trimmer comes with free fuel in the tank, which on inspection is in really good condition. However, I can't tell if it has any ethanol in it, which is the reason why this trimmer is in the condition that it's in. After pulling on the rope a few times, I can tell that the engine is fighting back quite well, so I'm pretty certain that it has plenty of compression and is not worn out. After that, I think it's time to put some fuel into the carb's throat and see if it'll start and run. So the good news is that the engine started and ran long enough to realize that it sounds very healthy. The bad news is that we now have a lot of work to do to get this trimmer working again. And of course, since it looks like this thing's been stored on the ground in a barn, I need to spray off as much dirt as possible. And while I was doing this, I also noticed that there was quite a bit of dirt and oil around certain parts of the engine, which means I'll have to focus on these parts. So the easiest way to get this machine back up and running would be to buy a kit consisting of the carb, fuel lines, filters, and even a spark plug. But the best part is that because of the aftermarket support for this brand, even with this model being more than 15 years old, these kits are cheap and plentiful. That means it could take as little as 2 to 3 days to get this machine back up and running, just so long as you don't have any other issues. Even though the kits are cheap, and if you know that you don't need the carb, piecing together your own kit is even cheaper. And what I mean by that is that I already have metering diaphragms, purge bulbs, fuel lines, filters, and even a few grommets waiting to be used. Of course, I bought these separate pieces in bulk, that way each part was very affordable. So you might be asking yourself,
how is that any better than just buying a kit online?
Simple, the answer is downtime. Now with these parts already on hand, I don't have to wait. I can assemble my own kit right here with everything that I have. However, there can be a few drawbacks. Now unless you have a large organizer to keep everything in, you're going to run out of one or more of these parts, so unless you have a Kanban system that's being managed, at some point you're going to be out of luck. Which is what's about to happen to this project here in a few minutes. Don't worry, when the time comes, I'll point out my mistake. Now, when mistakes happen like this, they're not all bad, and what we need to do is to use them as a learning tool to try to keep this from happening in the future again. Of course, I don't expect anybody in their right mind to buy 50 metering diaphragms, purge bulbs, and 100 feet of fuel line just so that you can get a great deal. But if you do, and you know that you're going to eventually use them all, you're going to do yourself a huge favor. And here's the best part, since this machine is what most would call worth fixing, the aftermarket support for it should be around for a very long time. It's when you have those cheaper throwaway machines that you'll find the aftermarket support is a bit lacking, mainly because there's no real money to be made on them. Now, I'm not saying that since you bought a cheap Homelight trimmer 12 years ago that you won't be able to find parts for it, but you might realize that there's only one aftermarket supplier making parts for it, and that's it. And there are no guarantees that they're going to keep making these parts for cheap trimmers in the near future, so buying a cheap trimmer makes short-term sense, but in the long term, I don't think so. So after taking a better look at the fuel lines and the grommet, you can see that some of the lines have hardened while others are extremely soft. But the part that obviously took it the worst was of course the rubber fuel tank grommet. Now these are typically made with a rubber that's not meant to resist ethanol, so when it comes to long-term contact with it, it'll become soft and squishy and basically fall apart. So here's the mistake that I made. So I do have plenty of these fuel tank grommets in my bag, but I didn't have a small one with 3 openings. I only had the ones with 2 openings. I did, however, have this one with 3 openings. It was just a little too large to fit in the tank opening though. Now I knew it was going to be tight, but I figured that it would just help to keep it from leaking any fuel in the future. But what ended up happening was that about a week later, it eventually caused the fuel lines that passed through it to collapse, causing a fuel flow issue, and I had to replace it with the correct size later on. Now, when I ordered the new part, I didn't just order a single part. Instead, I ordered a pack of 10. That way, I don't have to worry about having this issue again for at least the next year, and that's because I know I have several of these machines in the warehouse waiting to be fixed. So why didn't I just swap out one of those fuel tank grommets to use on this machine then? Well, guess what all those machines needed? And if you guessed fuel tank grommets, you'd be right. Now this tank grommet was so tough to install that I had to finish the installation off camera because I needed to get right over it to get the leverage I needed. Now too bad I was just going to have to do this job again in about a week, but this wasn't the only problem with this machine I had to fix. So as you can see, the trigger is broken, which is a common occurrence for this type of design, and it's pretty obvious as to why it broke. It's much too long, and because of its design, it sits too far away from the handle. This of course makes it a lot easier to break off. Now I do happen to have a parts trimmer, and luckily it had a good trigger on it, but like I said in the last video on this trimmer, I'll need to buy a replacement just to have on hand if I should need it again. I will say one thing though, I think they knew how easy it was going to be to break this part, so they designed the handle in such a way that it was going to be very easy to replace the trigger. Now on other models and even in the same brand, most times you have to take the entire handle apart to fix it, but not on this one. Now if this were my personal trimmer, I might try to store it with the trigger squeezed and then secure it to the handle with something that I could take off easily later on. I do have one of these in working condition, which I've done that too. It's in long-term storage right now until I figure out what I want to do with it. After that's done, I'll finally get to the carb and take it apart so I can inspect it. So what am I looking for when inspecting the carb? First, I need to make sure the inlet screen is clear of any debris. Then I need to check on the condition of all the diaphragms. And finally, I need to make sure that fuel will pass through the screen. Now, this type of pumping diaphragm rarely has any issues with it, so I'm not going to worry too much about this one. Which means the screen is my next concern. Luckily, it appears that it's completely clean, which is great news. That means we get to move on to the metering diaphragm, which is underneath this metal plate. Now, if your screen was covered with a lot of debris, it means the engine was running while the fuel filter had broken off the fuel line in the tank. So here's the metering diaphragm, and it's in pretty rough shape. It's not the worst I've seen, but it's certainly getting there. Now the diaphragm is supposed to help control fuel flow through the carb, so it's supposed to be soft and pliable, but this one has lost about 50% of its flexibility. However, to get a better feel for it, I'm going to remove it from the carb as well as the gasket. And once it's by itself, it's pretty much confirmed that it's definitely lost a lot of its flexibility and I would not want to reuse it, and instead I'm going to replace it. Now since it's not completely petrified, I'm going to throw it into the rejuvenation bath just on the off chance that in a pinch, I might have to use it for a future project. However, if that diaphragm was rock hard, there's no saving it in the bath and it's just best to throw it away. The last item I need to check is whether or not fuel will flow through the screen. After I put some on the screen, I'll then press the rocker arm and watch to see if fuel will disappear through it. Unfortunately, ours did not disappear, which means we need to clean the screen with some carb cleaner, but we need to remove the needle and rocker arm first, otherwise we might damage the needle. Now once they're out of the way, I'll then spray carb cleaner on the screen and agitate it until it disappears through the screen. Now this might take a few minutes or it might take a few seconds, and fortunately we didn't have to wait too long on this one. Next we'll put the carb back together. I will say one thing though, taking the carb apart to clean it can be very difficult for some, and if you lose any of these tiny parts, you're going to be in big trouble. Now, if you like a challenge, go for it. It's really not that difficult to do. However, depending upon the overall condition of the carb and how much you take it apart to clean it, there's always the chance that the carb is still not going to work. And of course, to avoid the situation, I would always recommend on just replacing the carb with either a cheap aftermarket one or a very expensive OEM part. The other consideration is if your time is extremely valuable to you. Of course, I'm not saying you need to make $50 an hour, but what I'm saying is that if you don't have a lot of time to give, then saving that time by buying a $17 part seems to make good money sense. So far, I replaced the diaphragm for $1, a purge bulb for 10 cents, the fuel lines for about $1, and finally a grommet valued at $3. That's a grand total of a little over $5, which I have to say is a steal compared to those cheap carb kits even without a carb. So was buying in bulk worth it? I'd say it was. Also, when connecting the fuel lines to the carb, the filter line will connect to the larger port while the return line connects to the smaller port. Now before I try and start the engine, I need to make sure fuel is flowing through the lines just like it's supposed to. So I need to put a small amount of it into the tank, try purging the air out of the system, and see what happens. Now this part is very important. If the bulb does not partially fill with fuel, then the likelihood that the engine is going to start is very low. So what do you do if the bulb will not fill with any fuel? Well, there are only a few choices. First, you can either take the carb back off and see if you can find an issue with it, or you can just order a new carb. So for me, if this happens, I would just order a new carb because I really don't feel like wasting any more of my time. Fortunately, ours is filling with fuel, and that's a great sign, so we'll move on to something that most people overlook. Now on small two-stroke engines, most of the mufflers will have a spark arrestor screen somewhere inside them, and just like their name implies, it keeps tiny sparks from leaving the engine and starting a fire. But sometimes these screens will start to clog up with carbon, and if enough collects there, it could block off the airflow out of the engine and cause your engine to not get to full speed and not have enough power either. Now this one is not that bad at all, only the far end of the screen has any buildup on it, and even though the screen is not going to cause any problems for the engine, since we've got it out anyway, I'm going to clean it using my torch. Of course, there are other ways to clean the screen like using carb cleaner or even oven cleaner, but I enjoy using the torch a lot more because it's a lot easier. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you should not throw away the screen, but I would recommend that you reinstall it just because the idea of destroying someone else's property doesn't sound nice. So it looks like servicing the carb with a new diaphragm and making sure that fuel is able to flow through the carb was all it needed to get this trimmer back to working condition. I will let you know that even though I only spent $5 in parts to get the engine working again, if I had just bought the cheap carb kit for the machine for only $17, it would have taken all the guesswork and uncertainty out of this project. I wouldn't have had to find out the part numbers, round up all the parts from different vendors, and hope that they work together. So if you take anything from this video, just know that if I wasn't such a penny pincher, I would have just bought the $17 carb kit and called it a day. And as far as the aftermarket is concerned, I think it's the best thing since gasoline was put into small engines, and I'm going to keep supporting them as long as I can because without them, we'd all have a lot less money in our pockets. So my question is, when you need to get parts, do you choose to get cheap aftermarket parts or do you only get OEM parts because of the difference in quality? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.